Today we're starting a brand new series called Paradox. So what is a paradox? Deep down, you're really shallow. A crowd is the loneliest place. Less is more. Those are three examples of a paradox. A paradox is a statement that appears to be contradictory or even maybe a little absurd, right? Like, what do you mean less is more? That's the opposite. But then you look a little closer and you go, wait a minute. Sometimes, like when I'm in an argument and I say less, it has more of an impact. So maybe less is more. So a paradox is a statement that appears to be contradictory, but when you look closer, you realize that it makes sense in a way that you never realized before. So why are we talking about this at church? Because if you really want to take Jesus seriously, then you have to understand paradoxes. If you think about it, it kind of makes sense that if God really is God, he would look at things from a different perspective than we do. Isaiah 55 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." So if Jesus really was communicating the thoughts of God, it would make sense that his teachings would kind of stretch us. 1 Corinthians 1:25 says, "For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom." You know, sometimes you would hear Jesus say things, and it sounded kind of foolish or maybe even a little bit crazy. But when you actually look closer, you realize it's wiser than any human wisdom. Maybe the best way that I can illustrate this is with physics. What happens when you take a pencil and you drop it into a glass of water? It looks like this, right? It looks, it looks crooked. It looks disjointed, doesn't it? But it's not, is it? The pencil is completely straight. But because of the refraction of the light on the water, the pencil appears to be crooked. So I want you to think about this. When you take God's perfect truth from heaven and you pass it into this very imperfect world, and we look at it with our imperfect human wisdom, what happens? It looks disjointed, right? It doesn't look quite right. Like those two things don't line up at all. And Jesus invites us to take a closer look and to realize that actually they line up perfectly. So you could say that this series that we're starting today is really kind of all about pulling the pencil out of the water. Because for the next several weeks, we're going to look at some very important teachings of Jesus that are paradoxical. And we're going to look at them and how Jesus taught them and how Jesus lived them, and how the rest of the New Testament kind of fleshes them out. And by doing that, with the help of the Holy Spirit, hopefully we're going to see how these seemingly kind of contradictory teachings actually make perfect sense. But before we dive in, let me just say one more thing about this. When Jesus was here in person, people couldn't quite figure him out, could they? He just didn't blend in. He challenged the way people thought. And if we're following that same Jesus, guess what should also be true of our own lives? People won't be able to figure us out. We won't just blend in. We would challenge the way people think. So here's the first paradox. Losing is gaining. In our culture today, there's a huge emphasis on finding out who you really are, expressing your true self. Don't try to live up to other people's expectations. Just be true to yourself. And that's probably good advice sometimes. But listen to what Jesus said. If you really want to find yourself, first you must lose yourself. And we're like, what? What does that even mean? Let's look at the passage. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? What can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. So based on this paradoxical teaching, let's talk about three things today. We're going to talk about the example, we're going to talk about the objection, and then we're going to talk about the invitation. So first, the example. Verse 21 says, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life." Now, that last phrase, the rising again part, it doesn't seem like the disciples even really heard that. Or if they heard it, they didn't understand it. You know, the thing that really registered with them was this chilling prediction that Jesus made that he was going to suffer and die. Now, notice that he didn't tell the disciples, "Hey guys, listen, we're going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to take some risks. And listen, there's a chance that it might not work out too well for me." No, he said, "I must suffer and be killed." And the obvious question there is why? There's a principle in life that if somebody wrongs another person, there's a debt that has to be paid. You can't just pretend that didn't happen, right? Someone always has to suffer with the debt. So in our country, when somebody breaks a law, if it's serious enough, they have to go to prison to pay the debt for the crime they committed. That's our justice system. It's very imperfect, but in general, most people agree that when you commit serious wrongs, there's a debt to pay. So we have this interesting practice in our country. I don't know if you know this or not, but every time a president or a governor steps down out of office, they have the power to pardon criminals, all right? So President Obama, he issued 212 pardons. George W. Bush issued 189 pardons, all right? So those pardons are kind of like when you're playing Monopoly. It's literally like a get-out-of-jail-free card, right? You're free to go. And usually pardons are used for times when the legal system has failed. Someone has been unjustly imprisoned, and the pardon sort of makes things right. But sometimes people get pardoned for very serious offenses. For example, back in 2012, Haley Barbour stepped down as governor from Mississippi, and he pardoned 4 murderers. One of the guys that he pardoned murdered a woman while she was holding her 6-week-old baby. Now, there was a public outcry against this, but the state Supreme Court still upheld those pardons. And according to Politico, he also gave pardons and early releases to people convicted of drug crimes, DUI deaths, burglary, and kidnapping. Now, how does that make you feel? I mean, that's not fair, right? Because we intrinsically know that when there's an offense, there's a debt that now exists, right? And it has to be paid by someone. You can't just arbitrarily erase it. And think about this. Haley Barbour issued those pardons at no cost to himself. All he had to do was sign a few papers and walk out of the governor's mansion, wave his hand, "You're pardoned." Now, what if that governor, he said, "You know what? This prisoner is serving a life sentence, and I've kind of made a big decision here. So I'm going to set him free, but I'm going to go to prison, and I'll serve out his sentence for him. Somebody has to pay for this debt and this crime, and I've decided I'm going to do it." That would be shocking, wouldn't it? Or better yet, how about this? This guy is on death row, but I'm going to pardon him, and I'll take the lethal injection for him. I mean, governors and presidents, they don't do that. Leaders just don't do that. One does. One did. Because in the eyes of God, we are all convicts. We are guilty on multiple counts of being self-centered, greedy, prideful, dishonest, and a million other things, right? The debt is real. And here's the thing. God doesn't just wave his hand and pardon the debt, because you can't just do that. Somebody has to pay for it. So he sent Jesus to the cross to pay our debt with his life. A king who suffers in place of his people. That's unheard of. Kings don't do that, but this king does. Our king does. And that's why Jesus had to go to Jerusalem and suffer and die. Because God so loved the world that he wanted to pardon us at infinite cost to himself. But here's the point for today's message. In order for Jesus to be the person he was born to be, To live out his true calling in life, to truly find himself, he had to lose himself. His calling in life was to let go of his life. That's what he told the disciples that day. And the disciples were not okay with this, right? They were not okay with this. And one of them spoke up and he said so. Which brings us to point number 2, the objection, right? Peter was so disturbed by what he just heard. It says, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. For a disciple to not just disagree with his master, but actually rebuke his master, that was also unheard of. I mean, Peter had some audacity to do this, but he probably felt so right when he was saying it. He felt like there's no way that this could be the plan. And if necessary, Jesus intended on defending Jesus, right? And he probably thought that Jesus was going to be so impressed with his courage. Well, he was wrong. Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Wow. I mean, Jesus could have said, Peter, listen, I appreciate your concern, but you're not seeing this clearly. He could have just mildly insulted him, like, Peter, don't be an idiot. But calling him Satan? I mean, you know why he said that, though, right? At the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, right before he went public, he spent 40 days fasting in the wilderness. And during that time, do you remember what happened? He was tempted by Satan. And the temptations, they took on different forms, and they were all very real offers from the devil. But the bottom line of these offers was this: Jesus, you can accomplish your mission without going through any suffering. You don't have to do that. You can have the kingdom without going to the cross. Jesus knew that there was a price that he must pay. So he rejected Satan's offer. So now 3 years later, here's Peter. Basically repeating the same temptation, right? You don't need to go through all that suffering, Jesus. Bible commentator A.B. Bruce said this. This is so good. Jesus recognizes here his old enemy in a new and even more dangerous form. For none are more formidable instruments of temptation than well-meaning friends who care for our comfort more than our character. Wow. Let me read that again. None are more formidable instruments of temptation than well-meaning friends who care more for our comfort than our character. Some of you really needed to hear that today, because you've got a well-meaning friend or well-meaning friends who are telling you to take the easy way out. And today God is reminding you that is not the voice of Jesus. So Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." And then he says, you don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. In other words, Peter, you're using human logic here. You think that if I lose my life, that means defeat? You think that if I lose my life, my mission fails? That's human logic. What you don't realize is that the only way for my mission to be accomplished and for sin to be forgiven and for love to be released into the world is for me to lose my life. So there was a paradox here that Peter just didn't understand. To Peter, the pencil looked crooked, right? Peter thought there's no way that you suffering matches up with victory. Like those two things just don't line up. And Jesus was saying, can't you see that my suffering is the only path to victory? So here's the question. Can we overcome our natural objection to suffering and really believe that for Jesus to truly succeed, that he needed to lose his life? And here's a more personal question for you. Can you really believe that for you to truly succeed, you need to lose your life too? And that leads to the final point, the imitation. So this passage isn't just about this paradoxical principle in the life of Jesus. It's about the same principle in our own lives. Look at verse 24. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." So what does that mean, to take up your cross and follow him? In our culture, if somebody says to you, oh, everybody has a cross to bear, what do they mean? Everybody has some annoying or difficult thing in their life, right? Like, what's your cross to bear? Oh, it's my in-laws. They kind of drive me crazy, and they're coming over for Thanksgiving, and I got to spend the whole day with them. Yeah, they're sitting up there, so I had to kind of throw that out there. Well, or my cross to bear is this arthritis or this bad back or some tough part of life. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. He's saying, look, since I, the king, have to give up my life, if you want to follow me, you also have to give up your life. Not just put up with an annoying in-law or things in your life and your otherwise unchanged life, right? But actually let go of your whole life. Give it up, put it to death. Probably not physical death, although God does sometimes call people to die for their faith. But it's still a very real death. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. So what does that actually mean? Let me give you two implications of this. First, it means that I need to die to my old identity, right? The word for life he uses here is the Greek word shuka. So he's talking about what gives you your identity, your sense of self. So he's not saying you need to throw your ID in the trash and just forget about who you are and become one with the universe. That's Zen Buddhism. That's transcendental meditation. Jesus isn't saying that at all. Jesus says lose your life. Why? So you can find it. So how do you do that? Well, in verse 26 he says, what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? In other words, stop trying to build your identity on things that you can gain in this world. Because that's what we do, right? We say, oh, I feel like somebody. I feel worthwhile because I've gained what? You fill in the blank there. A good career, a beautiful home, a beautiful wife, the approval of my family, the respect of my friends. We instinctively form our identity based on things we gain in this world. But you know what the problem with that is, right? If anything goes wrong with my career or my home or my wife or the way that my friends feel about me, what happens? My sense of identity is threatened and it could fall completely apart. And Jesus says you need to find a whole new way. Die to your old identity, which is not an easy thing to do. And base your identity on what I did for you at the cross and who I am in your life every day. And as you make Jesus the center of your thoughts and your worship and your affections, you start to gain this new identity. And it's not based on how many pounds you lost last week or how many new customers you were able to bring in. It's based on Christ. And when you start to build your identity on Christ, you start to become the person who you were created to be. I love the way C.S. Lewis describes this at the end of his book, Mere Christianity. Look at this. The more we get what we now call ourselves out of the way and let him take us over, the more truly ourselves we become. There's so much of him that millions and millions of little Christs, all different, will still be too few to express him fully. In that sense, our real selves are all waiting for us in him. It is no good trying to be myself without him. The more I resist him and try to live on my own, the more I become dominated by my own heredity and upbringing and surroundings and natural desires. He says it is when I turn to Christ, when I give myself up to his personality, that I first begin to have a real personality of my own. So he says, die to your old identity, and Jesus says, I will give you a new identity, the one you were always meant to have. You will be more fully you than you ever were. And the other implication of losing our lives is this. I need to die to my old agenda. We're kind of talking about this morning a little bit. You know why Peter was so quick to rebuke Jesus, right? Because Jesus was challenging Peter's agenda. Peter just assumed that Jesus would eventually rise up and declare himself king and take the throne. So Peter's agenda was to be connected to this Jesus guy, the rising star. And then Jesus says, well, look, the Son of Man has to suffer and be killed. And Peter freaks out because if that was true, it might mean suffering for Peter too. And that definitely wasn't on Peter's agenda. Listen, if you come to Jesus clutching on to your old agenda, you're actually just intending to use him. For instance, if you come to Jesus saying, I want to follow you, Lord, so you can get me a husband or a wife. Or you're just using him as a means to an end, right? If I come to Jesus and I say, I want to follow you, Lord, so that you can get me out of this financial mess that I'm in. He's a tool to carry out your agenda. When you come to a king, you die to your own agenda. And you say, well, I'm not coming to tell you what to do for me, Lord. I want to get on board with your agenda. I'm not here to use you. I'm here to worship you. I'm here to serve you. Maybe you will bring me a husband or a wife, or maybe you will get me out of this financial mess. But even if you don't, I'll still have you, and that will be enough. Now, let me ask you on a deeper level. Do you believe that? That you can truly let go of your agenda and your demands? And if your answer is finally yes, then that's when life will truly get good for you. I want to give you a vision of how your life could look if you take Jesus up on this invitation. If you choose to stop holding on to your life and choose to lose your life for Christ, you will go from self-focused to Christ-focused. You will go from self-conscious to self-forgetful, from insecure to secure, from cautious to bold, from fearful to fearless, from self-indulgent to self-denying, from building your kingdom to building God's kingdom, from holding your possessions tightly to holding them loosely, from controlling to submitting. In short, when you lose your life for Christ, you'll get over yourself. And what a beautiful thought, right? Jesus is the one power in this world that truly enables us to just get over ourselves. And not only that, but don't forget the little note of hope that was buried in Jesus' words. The disciples didn't even hear it, I don't think. In verse 21, Jesus said he would suffer and be killed, but then he said one more thing. He said, and on the third day, I'll be raised to life. Don't ever forget that it ended for Jesus really, really well. So the suffering and the dying were temporary. And for us, if we follow him, we have to take up our cross and die to our old identity. And that's a painful process. We have to die to our old agenda, and that can be excruciating. And then, if we do that, life might be so different than we ever thought it could be. But God says it's going to end really, really well for us. Because just as Jesus rose again, we will rise again. And there will be a future without suffering and without death. It's going to end incredibly well. So in the meantime, let me finish by quoting C.S. Lewis again. Give up yourself, and you will find your real self. Lose your life, and you will save it. Submit to death, the death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him. And with him, everything else thrown in. If you are here today and you would like to make that decision, to make Jesus the Lord of your life, to be that guiding light in your life, we want to invite you to do that today. If you want to be baptized, if you want to give your life to the Lord and commit your life to him, you have that opportunity. There's no time like the present. Would you stand with me as we close in prayer? Dear God, Lord, we love you so much. We thank you for this time we've had to gather today and to listen to your word, Lord, and to think about these teachings that you've given us, these paradoxes, or seemingly paradoxes, that just might not make any sense to the normal everyday person, Lord, but as Christians, it should make perfect sense to us. Lord, help us to follow you, for you to be the true guiding light in our life. We love you so much, Lord. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.